Good morning. My name is Hendrik van Genderen. I'm the Water Resources Engineer at the Water Authority Cayman. I will turn this session over shortly to Mrs. Sara-Jade Govia, who will moderate this panel discussion. Welcome to our panel discussion about building climate resilience in the Caribbean. We are fortunate to have a dynamic panel of persons with a diverse background who have worked extensively on climate issues in the Caribbean. I expect a lively discussion. First of all, I want to give a warm thank you to our conference sponsors. We really appreciate the support of Sandpick Contracting Cayman Limited, Deal Metering, Maya, Water Engineering and Pipeline Company Limited, WEBCO, Consolidated Water Company Limited, Dart Enterprises Limited, Florida Aqua Store, and Argo American. Before we get started on this session, I would like to briefly review a few housekeeping items. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions at any time throughout the discussion. Just use the question and answer section in the Zoom or Whova dialog box. And Mrs. Sara-Jade Govia, who will moderate this panel discussion, will use your questions throughout the discussion. Except for the moderators and panelist microphones, all other microphones will be muted. We also ask that apart from the moderator and panelists, everybody else turns off their cameras. I now turn this session over to Mrs. Sara-Jade Govia, the current president of the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association, who will moderate this session.
Thank you, Hendrik. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sara-Jade Govia, and I'm the president of the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. I am also the water sector specialist at the Ministry of Public Utilities, and there I develop policy and strategy for the technical, regulatory, and institutional challenges in the water and sanitation sectors. And a large part of the work that I do is advising the government on implementing investment priorities to future-proof these sectors, water and sanitation. And the issue of climate change is getting more and more urgent. By the end of this month, October, the United Kingdom will host the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the parties. And we all know that as a short name, COP26, and that is to be held in Glasgow in the United Kingdom later this month. And this is the summit that will bring together all the parties, all the states, to accelerate action toward the goal of this Paris Agreement, as well as the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in the lead up to the summit, there's been quite a lot of media attention and controversy on the summit. And on one hand, the Australian Prime Minister has suggested that he may not be attending. And of course, one of the more popular parts of media attention has been on Greta Thunberg, who is a well-known, very young climate activist. And she has recently dismissed the actions from global leaders, referring to it as blah, blah, blah. And the Caribbean region is definitely very much a subject of impacts of climate change. Weather patterns are changing with more pronounced periods of drought, more and frequent occurrences of intense hurricanes, and of course, impacts of rising sea levels. And those are just a few of some of the issues that we faced, and not to mention the threat multiplier of COVID-19 and other socioeconomic and geopolitical crises that we are facing in the Caribbean. The introduction of the April 2020 report on the state of the Caribbean climate, prepared by the Climate Studies Group at Mona campus of the University of West Indies, states that in the Caribbean, weather and climate events recurrently impact economic performance, productivity, livelihoods, and quality of life. The record-breaking 2017 hurricane season stands as one of several recent examples that strongly underscore the economic, physical, and social vulnerability of Caribbean nations to climate-related phenomena. Evidence-based and proactive decision-making will be fundamental to the transformation process from vulnerable to resilient Caribbean societies. With that backdrop, the CWWA's plenary discussion will address building climate resilience in the Caribbean. And on behalf of the CWWA and the local organizing committee in Cayman, I'd like to thank the panelists for agreeing to participate in this discussion. And at this time, I'll just ask them to turn on their cameras, and I would also briefly introduce them. So we have with us today Dr. Ulric Trotz, who is very popular in the region for climate change. He is a previous Deputy Director and Science Advisor at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize, 5Cs. Also with us is Ms. Gina Ebanks-Petrie, who is the Director of the Department of Environment in Cayman Islands. We also have Dr. Karl Payne, Lecturer and Water Resources Program Coordinator, Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, SUMES, at the Cayville campus of the UWI. We also have with us Dr. Kirk Douglas, who is the Director for the Center for Biosecurity Studies at the Cayville campus of the UWI, and also Dr. Hugh, who is a lecturer in climate change and water resources management at SUMES as well. So I'd ask them to just turn on their cameras, and I would be grateful if they would just give us a brief introduction, and also in that introduction, elaborate on the work that they've done on climate change and building climate resiliency in the Caribbean. And also from your viewpoint to the panelists, what are some of the key points for building climate resiliency in the Caribbean? So I'll start with Dr. Trotz.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Well, I have been at the Climate Change Center since its inception in 2005. But before that, I was started the work in the Caribbean on dealing with climate change since 1997 with the first Jeff project. So I've been in the trenches for quite a long time. Water has emerged as one of the critical issues that we in the Caribbean will have to deal with. From the point of view of its availability, the possibility of scarcity of resource, that is one issue we have to deal with. The other one is when we get too much and we can't manage it, and we get all these floods, etc. So it's basically parching, drought, and flood, and a succession of these events that we have to deal with. What I would like to say is that we have a lot of knowledge in the Caribbean about where we want to go with the water sector. We have managed to get some resources from the GCF for a major water program with the Barbados Water Authority. And also, I think the Germans, GIZ, have got a similar program going in Grenada. Our biggest challenge in the Caribbean basically is access to resources. The other issue is that the recent literature coming out from the IPCC and all of the reports shows us that we don't have time. And so as far as building resilience is concerned, two issues: that it's time for action, and we have to find some way in which we can ensure that the resources that are required for the transformation in the water sector, those resources are available. And we hope that our political directorate and those who attend the October conference will put resource accessibility, and not only accessibility, but accessibility in a timely manner, a timely fashion, is critical if we are going to succeed in dealing with the objectives of building a climate resilient water sector in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz, and we'll talk a little bit more later on the role of Caribbean leaders in COP26. I'd like now to ask Ms. Petrie to introduce herself and just talk a little bit about your work, Ms. Petrie, on climate change and building climate resiliency in the Caribbean.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel this morning. As you know, my name is Gina Ebanks-Petrie. I'm the director for the Department of Environment here in the Cayman Islands. I celebrated my 37th anniversary of working in the Department of Environment, or at least it's from its predecessor, the Natural Resources Unit, on October 1st. So that was a stark reminder of how long I've been working in this field. Not all of my work is related to climate change, but I did have the pleasure of working with Dr. Trotz and his team at the 5 Cs several years ago now to develop our first national climate change policy, which I regret to say is still in draft form. We have a government now that was elected earlier this year who seems very keen to move the issue of climate change adaptation for our country along swiftly. So we're trying to ride that wave, as it were, and get a lot of work, play a lot of catch up. Having said that, I've also worked for several years on a national energy policy, which was adopted by the government in 2017, and which has adopted some aspirational goals in terms of emissions, reducing emissions, and also meeting 70% of our energy demand from renewables by 2037. We also had a health sector conference led by PAHO, I believe, a couple of years ago. And that sort of galvanized the health sector into starting to think about climate change impacts, and what that might look like for healthcare in the country. And of course, in my area of work, we have been doing our part as best we can to protect natural systems that we know will help mitigate the effects of climate change, but also are now well known for sequestering carbon and storing carbon. So mangrove systems, our seagrass beds, etc. Earlier this year, we passed regulations that protect almost 50%, or actually slightly over 50% of our shallow shelf area around the 3 islands in no-take marine protected areas. A lot of those are protecting seagrass and some mangroves. And we're also trying to promote and escalate the establishment of protected areas in those key natural systems. So I'll just close off there and say thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Ebanks-Petrie, and I think your 37 years is one of the knowledge assets that Dr. Trotz was talking about that the region has. So let me move on to Dr. Payne. Dr. Payne, please briefly introduce yourself and some of the work that you've done on climate change and building climate resiliency in the region.
Sure. So first, from the outset, let me thank the CWWA for providing this opportunity to serve as a panelist. I think it's fitting that the recently announced Nobel, well, 2 of the 3 recently announced Nobel Prizes in physics are researchers that did seminal work on climate change and actually developing climate models. And their projections were right on target. Between the 1970s and 2000s, they projected a 0.5 increase in global temperatures. And as alluded to earlier, the researchers within the region at MONA have been able to build on that seminal work and make projections of what the future climate will be. Some of the drying trends, for example, where I am at Surmis in Barbados, we expect by the 2050s a decline in average annual rainfall of 20%. So I think to be more climate resilient in the future, the work that I do is going to be important because I work at the nexus of climate change and water resources. And specifically, what some of the work that I've done over the past 10 years in this area has been on trying to understand the issue of saline intrusion. And this is a major problem in many small island developing states that can be seen as coastal, the entire island basically being a coastal zone. So how do we manage our scarce water resources under a changing climate? For example, if there's over-exploitation, over-pumping within coastal regions, this can exacerbate this salinization process. And with sea level rise and a reduction in average annual precipitation, this is going to be something that we need to pay careful attention to. But we need to have the quantitative tools in order to make sound scientific decision making. So I would say that the research that I've done within the academic realm over the past decade or so has been around the issue of trying to develop these computer models that help us to have a quantitative understanding of the nexus between climate change and water resources. And then in industry, in the US, I've worked in innovative technologies that are aimed at mitigating the impacts of, every year there are 51 billion tons of CO2 being released into the atmosphere. So innovative technologies and working as a research engineer to develop new technologies that we think hold some promise in offsetting those CO2 emissions.
Thank you, Dr. Payne, and we'll talk a little bit more later on leveraging technology and also how some of your work informs policy making and decision making on a wider level as well. So let me move now to Dr. Douglas. Dr. Douglas, briefly introduce yourself to our audience and also explain to us from your viewpoint, the key points for building climate resiliency in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Ms. Govia. I want to also extend thanks to CWWA for welcoming and inviting CBS, Center for Biosecurity Studies, to be a part of the discussion of this panel. I think that climate change is one of the largest major factors it is a broad issue that intersects many different fields of study. Primarily, my research in the past has been in the realm of infectious diseases and zoonotic diseases as well, which also are impacted by climate change and resilience. However, in my current remit as the director of the Center for Biosecurity Studies, the nexus with water and water resources is obvious, it's apparent, but it needs a lot of work in terms to leverage the resources that we have, the advantages that we have as well. And I think that was where I would perhaps start in terms of what I think are some of the issues or the challenges that the water resource and wastewater management will face. Being able to connect the dots is what I think the Center for Biosecurity Studies is about, that interdisciplinarity. For instance, let's take a look at water, and Karl would have mentioned the drying trend that is going to be experienced within the Caribbean. So we're going to have less rainfall, we're going to have higher temperatures. Not that we're not going to have rainfall, that rainfall will be intense in very short periods of time, which can also lead to flooding. But the overall trend would be a drying trend, which means that there's going to be a higher demand for water and we have limited water resources. So we have to then strategize on how will we actually meet that challenge. One thing I can say is in terms of building the intersectoral connections, for instance, for the fire department. We know within the Caribbean, we have a wet season, we have a dry season. During the dry season, what we will expect is that we'll have more fires, whether they be natural or even if they be residential or commercial, or even for the waste management sector, we have open landfills as well. Some of them are sanitary, some of them are not. And so the draw or the demand for water for that particular sector is something that I think is a missed opportunity, something that we can definitely gather data for. And you need data in order to plan, in order to build the level of resilience that you need to mitigate against different risks. So you should be able to quantify what is or estimate the demand that the Barbados, well, in our case, the Barbados Fire Service, for instance. What is their demand for water? Do they even quantify how many gallons of water that they use per year or per month? And so then within the planning of the water sector, how do they then now try to meet their demand? And maybe they don't have to use potable water. Maybe they can use, non-potable water for some of the fires that they're out. So that would reduce the demand on the potable water stores. So these are some of the intersecting connections that can be made and will help in terms of building the level of resilience. Because if you know beforehand, and as Karl mentioned, using technology, using modeling, then you can build that data that can inform your decision in terms of your 5-year planning, because your plan is not only be for this year or the next year, but you want to look on a long-term view of where are you going to go and how do you get there, and step by step. So I think those are two critical things I would say would be helpful in building the level of resilience, because oftentimes the siloed way of approaching problems it's a product of of our culture and the way how I think we're educated as well. We were educated to be, specialists in one area rather than not only being a specialist in one area, but also understanding some of the actual intercalating themes and fields of study. So those are the two things that I would say. So data poverty is a big issue. We don't collect enough data, and data that is relevant to decision making. So I think that is one area that we will definitely need to improve on. The absence of the intersectoral collaboration, and also the nexus with human health. I think that is emerging now. I would rather say re-emerging, because we know that infectious diseases are spread due either to a lack of water or even with too much water, as in the case of flood. So at the center, we are embarking on climate infectious nexus program, where we are trying to build that interdisciplinarity, pulling from different areas, with persons with different expertise, to try to come up with comprehensive ways of addressing certain issues. So we're hopeful that we can lend some value, and we are definitely willing to collaborate and to assist where necessary. So thanks.
Yeah, and the whole concept, as you mentioned, Dr. Douglas, about master planning is something that we also have to look at it regionally, and what other country are all our countries master planning when it comes to water resources and sanitation and solid waste. Let's move on now to Dr. Seeley. Dr. Seeley, can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience and also just elaborate on some of the work that you're doing and how it impacts climate change and building resiliency in the region?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the CWWA for inviting me to be on this panel. As you said in the introduction, I'm a lecturer at Surmees. I teach in the climate change program, but I'm also a special envoy for Barbados on climate change and a special advisor to the government. And so I wanted to start at that level as to what's happened at the international level and what we're trying to get out of Glasgow later this month. The situation is that there's going to be a big push for adaptation financing from the developing countries in the context where $80 billion US dollars per year is being transferred over as climate finance, but greater than 70% of that is loans. Only about 20–25% of that is going towards adaptation. The bulk of it is going towards mitigation, and only 2% of that is coming to small islands, and that's small islands all over the world. So a smaller percentage of that 2% is actually coming to the Caribbean. So there's going to be a big push for the developing countries are going to tell the developed countries, if you don't mitigate, and we're at 1.2 degrees of warming now, then at least give us the money so that we can adapt and that we can build resilience. And that's going to be the push. So there's going to be a global goal for adaptation that's going to be discussed. At the national level, at the Barbados level, I want to speak a little bit to our Roofs to Reefs program, which is essentially become our national adaptation plan. And in that, we're going to spend the equivalent of over $1 billion over the next decade to build resilience, particularly in the water sector. And that's equivalent to 1.5% to 3% of our GDP being spent annually to build this resilience. And recognizing that Barbados is water scarce, less than 300 cubic meters of total freshwater resources per capita per year, recognizing, as Karl and others have said, that we're going to face reduced precipitation, 20% less by 2050. We're going to have to work hard, especially in the water sector where you're losing greater than 40% of the water in non-revenue water. You are already underinvested and you need over $200 million to be able to fix your NRW. So what are the major things that we're going to do? One, we're going to push money into the water sector from the energy sector, recognizing that there's going to be a massive changeover from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and there's going to be a lot of investment in renewable energy. The government has decided that 16% of the renewable energy sector is going to be cut off and given to the Barbados Water Authority for first-time investment, so they can free up some capital to be able to invest back in the water sector. Two, we've decided that we can no longer put wastewater out to sea, that we're going to have water reuse. So we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade our 2 municipal wastewater treatment plants to tertiary treatment. We're putting the legislation in place to allow for groundwater recharge and irrigation, using a principle of fit for purpose. In other words, the quality of the water that is produced is fit for the intended end purpose. And that's all that under the Roofs to Reefs. But we also recognize under Roofs to Reefs, and this is a personal experience that I had when I was actually president of the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association back in 2004, and Ivan had hit Grenada. And we were determined as the CWWA to provide assistance to a fellow utility that was struggling to get water back in service. And so we flew into Grenada 4 days after Ivan had hit. And it was absolutely clear that the Grenadians' ability to recover after disaster, which is a definition of resilience, was hampered by the fact that they lost their own homes. They had no electricity, they had no water. So how could I ask a linesman from a utility company to go and fix a pipe when they had nothing at home? So to me, it brought in a mantra of resilience begins at home. So what we will do under our Roofs to Reefs program, which is a bit of a pun on Ridge to Reef, which is, as we all know, is integrated watershed management linked to integrated coastal zone management, but with the emphasis on people's homes. So with the roofs, we're going to go after the roofs and try to make the roofs resilient. All of our roofs, 30,000 properties, resilient to a Category 4 hurricane. Then we're going to give them potable water storage with a pump, so that in the event that you lose the water grid, you have 10 days of potable water storage. Then we're going to give you rainwater harvesting tanks, so to again augment our water supply and increase overall storage capacity on the island, which inherently has little storage capacity, both below ground and above ground. And then finally, on the water side, the wastewater side, recognizing that our municipal sewage systems cover less than 10% of the population, and therefore you have a number of point sources of wastewater discharges into the ground. That's going on to the coast, that's damaging our coral reefs, and we need those coral reefs as resilience for shores. Therefore, we have to go after the nutrients, particularly nitrogen, in our wastewater, and we will look for technologies that we can use at a household scale or small community scale to take out the nitrogen out of our wastewater before it's discharged. So that's a program that we're going to try and roll out. I'm trying to get across that at the international scale, we recognize that we need finance to build this resilience. And at the national scale, at least in Barbados' case, we've recognized that our freshwater sector is perhaps the most vulnerable. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Seeley, and that was definitely you know, a lot in terms of, you gave us some really good statistics on how climate financing is allocated, and I mean, eye-opening for those of us that may not be aware of how it works. And I think the issue of people risk when it comes to disasters is very real. And even in Trinidad and Tobago, we are trying to do a national rainwater harvesting program, and we're recognizing that you have one of the sort of fundamental building blocks of that is securing roofs. And the most vulnerable don't have proper roofing. So when hurricanes hit, landslides hit, of course they are affected. So let me switch gears a little bit and go to Dr. Douglas. And my question to you, Dr. Douglas, is, do you think that because of COVID-19, some of the Caribbean governments are dropping the ball on climate change, building climate change resilience?
I wouldn't say that they're dropping the ball. The way we view biosecurity is the science and practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods. And so there is a balance that has to be struck when you are in governance. This is by no means an easy situation to govern or to manage. So I would not make a carte blanche statement and say, you know, they're taking their eye off the ball, because you really are dealing with livelihoods in terms of climate change and the impacts of it. But you also have a pandemic that's not only affecting the Caribbean, but also the entire world. And it has a lot of radiating impacts on trade, on the movement of goods and services. So it is really a very complicated situation. I think all of the leaders would want to tackle everything all at once. But the reality is that you're going to, if a fire is in your home, you are going to look for your most valuable possessions, and you're going to probably look for those or preserve your life. So there are many decisions that will have to be made, and hindsight is always 20/20, and people have opinions. But I think that this comes back to the point about data poverty. Without having, you know, certain key data, then it is difficult to make sound, effective decisions. And so I think that is an area that the Caribbean definitely needs to do to improve risk management, to improve resilience, whether it be climate, whether it be any impact that is going to be external to the Caribbean, that then will have an impact on the Caribbean. So that would be what I would say.
Thank you. And I'd just like to encourage those in our audience to feel free to submit questions in the chat, and let's pose that to our panelists. Let me move to Dr. Trotz. Dr. Trotz, you have spent your career advising on science and, as Dr. Douglas said, using data to try to drive decision-making. What has been your experience like in advising policymakers and decision-makers? Have they been listening to you on this issue of climate change? What would you do differently, or what would you push the envelope more about?
I think in the Caribbean, our policy makers basically have been very responsive. I don't know how much of the Caribbean know that in fact we have in place a regional strategy and an implementation plan as far as climate change is concerned. Climate change now is a permanent item on the agenda of heads of government when they meet. There is knowledge, there is concern, there has been a response. If you look at all of the countries in the Caribbean, they're basically up to date with the sort of reporting that has to be done for the UNFCCC. They all have national climate change adaptation plans. They have also plans for low carbon development and transformation of the energy sector. So there is a lot of sensitivity about the issues. And I mean, Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados has been very vocal on the international stage about our vulnerability and the need basically for the global community to provide us with the sort of resources that are required. That's where the big battle is. Our country is basically, it's not that we don't know what to do. If you listen to my fellow panelists about the amount of plans we have in the region, but a lot of these plans are just expressions of intent. We need resources. That is a strong message. We need the resources to basically make the transformation that is necessary. But I think that our policymakers have been very responsive. And at the center, we've been, for instance, going into the Conference of Parties each year, we do have regional consultations. We come up with regional positions. Our political representatives at COP are briefed. So, you know, I cannot complain about the level of interest, the level of response, just that we lack the resources to make take the actions that we need to take.
Miss Ebanks-Petrie, any reactions, your lessons learned and sort of critical success factors based on your 37 years experience in the environmental field, you know? You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, I think certainly speaking from the perspective in Cayman, I think that I would have liked to have seen earlier adoption of climate change adaptation plans, etc. in Cayman. It's something that we've been pushing at the Department of Environment for a long time. And I actually think that this is one of the problems that we're experiencing in Cayman is that until very recently, I think climate change has always been seen as a quote unquote environmental issue. So a lot of it has been sort of pushed into the Department of Environment sort of sphere. But I think that gradually there is an understanding that climate change is everybody's business, that we all sectors need to have a coordinated approach to our response in terms of adaptation, there needs to be national coordination. In fact, that climate change and the impacts of climate change need to be mainstreamed into all of our decision making here and in, you know, throughout the Caribbean. I think that is gradually taking hold. We are lining up to do a climate change risk assessment later this year as a way of updating our climate change policy, which was dated from 2011. So thankfully, as I was flicking through that, we've actually managed to tick off a number of things that we had set ourselves as goals in that policy. But I do think that I think regionally, the whole question of where climate change sits and the importance that it's given in our national planning, etc., may need to be revisited. That's my opinion. And specifically in Cayman, I think that I really am looking forward to, in the next few years, making very, very big strides towards getting the country grounded in some kind of national plan for tackling climate change, both from, by the way, an adaptation and a mitigation perspective, because when we look at our per capita mitigation figures, we understand that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, we contribute relatively nothing to the emissions picture globally. But I think from a moral perspective, when we get on a global stage and we say to people, we need you to act because we are some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, it helps to be able to say, we are also doing our part in terms of mitigation. And certainly in Cayman, when we look at our per capita emissions, they are alarming. And I think that there is a lot of scope here for us to do a lot better in that regard as well.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Payne, on from your perspective, you have a lot of experience in using technology and computer vision, as you said in your bio, to look at water resources management. How are we leveraging technology and innovation in the Caribbean toward making sure that our water sector is appropriately resilient to the climate change impacts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think is fortuitous that the theme of the conference is on innovation and smart technologies, because I think I want to start at the global picture, coming from working in the tech industry, and then transitioning back into academia. But if we look at the US, for example, there's lots of private sector driven venture capital that is going into innovative and smart. We know what the issues are. So how about if the private sector is a bit more nimble and comes up with some innovative technologies that would mitigate against, as I mentioned before, this 50 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. For example, the Breakthrough Energy Fund by the Bill Gates Group is funding things like direct air capture. And there's also a push for CO2 sequestration. And I believe within the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see more and more of a pivot into electric vehicles. And by the way, I should mention, this is a notable point in Barbados, where in the public transportation sector, there's several electric vehicles on the road now. And I'm hearing more and more about projects utilizing solar energy and potentially hydrogen to offset or to replace fossil fuels as the major source of energy. So that there's that nexus, and there are good things happening in as I said, in the pivot towards electric vehicles, utilizing more solar energy in the water sector. So those are good things. But I'm just wondering if we're missing our industry within the Caribbean region, if we're missing some opportunities by not slow diffusion of smart technology and innovation. So not only can we, as Dr. Seeley pointed out, about 2% of the financing is going to small island developing states. But what if we could increase that percent by being a bit more innovative in the water and wastewater space? So I see that as a major opportunity. But as I mentioned before, there are good things happening on the ground in the region. And getting to the financing issue, there was a Bloomberg article that came out, I think last year, where Prime Minister Motley in Barbados negotiated these sovereign debt contracts, I believe. So there's also innovative ways, and that's a clause in debt repayment, where if there's some calamitous natural hazard, then there's some break from paying the principal and interest for some period of time. So I think there's lots of innovation that we need if we're going to be more resilient.
Thank you, Dr. Payne, and I'll ask Dr. Seeley to come in here, but also we have a direct question, a specific question in the chat about the reason for using Cat 4 roofing standards instead of 5, and also if there's any consideration for implementing building codes for these new homes to meet that standard as a whole and not just the roof.
Okay, so I saw the question in the chat. Thanks, Sarah. The answer for why Cat 4 and not Cat 5 is because Cat 5 is open-ended. So I can't guarantee against a Category 5 because I don't know what the end wind speed is going to be. Whereas Cat 4 ends at 156 miles per hour. So that's a number we can plan for. We used to plan for Cat 3 under our old building codes, and yes, we do have building codes. Not sure that we implement them and we force compliance with them, but we do have these building codes. And the answer to your question about, is it only the roof? No, it's not the roof only. The roof is a euphemism for the entire house. You've got to hold that roof on down to the loading walls. And then you've got to make sure those loading walls are held down to the foundation. And we see three sets of problems with our housing. One, the slopes of the roofs are too shallow, and they should be steeper. Two, they aren't tied down to the superstructure. And the superstructure in a lot of cases is sitting on a loose foundation, because that goes back to post-slavery, when you put your house on the back of a donkey cart and you moved it to the next place of employment. Now we have to tie down these structures. We got lazy with Janet in 1955, in the sense that we built back quickly, not build back better. And we have to learn from that mistake. I think those are the questions, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let me bring back, well, let me go back to you, Dr. Seeley, and then I'll ask Dr. Douglas to come in here. But we've talked a lot about, the government side, and even a little bit about individuals, but how we're leaving out the private sector. What is the role of the private sector? And how is, in your case in Barbados, how is the private sector brought in this equation of building climate resilience?
I'll give you one example. Waste management, which we haven't touched on yet in terms of a disaster, but it becomes a huge issue post-disaster. I saw it in Grenada again in 2004. We have a private sector-run materials recovery facility, or MRF, and that started operation in 2009. So when Tropical Storm Thomas passed in 2010, and we got lots of damaged trees and galvanized sheets all over the place, we were able to recover that material through the private sector run MRF, and then reuse that material, which took a big headache out of the waste management side of post-disaster. From a government standpoint, the government is looking at how you get the private sector to invest in building resilience. It's quite easy for us, easy relative term, to bring private sector investment into mitigation. You set the feed-in tariffs at an attractive and you send a stable economic signal to the private sector, and we're attracting that foreign investment. By the way, I agree with my colleague entirely from the Cayman Islands. We've got to put our money where our mouth is in terms of mitigation. And Barbados has submitted the most ambitious NDC out of any Caribbean island, because we've said that we're going to go 70% absolute reductions economy-wide by 2030, and we're going to aim for that 100%. But on the adaptation side, I think that I wanted to get one quick point across about what we can do on a regional scale that's practical. When Soufriere blew up in July this year in St. Vincent was in trouble in terms of being able to get water out to their people, and we tried our best, again within the CWA, to lend that assistance. At the same time, Barbados was suffering from a chronic water shortage and was not able to meet demand. And we started looking around the region as to who we could import water from. And it's not that simple. And I'm wondering, and I'm just throwing it out as a wild thought, have we gotten to a stage now where we need to look regionally at our capacity to move large volumes of fresh water to where we need it post a disaster? Because it's going to happen over and over again. Not sure if I've answered your, Sarah, because I've gone off on a tangent, but please forgive me.
No, I mean, you've really brought to bear something that my team and I worked on just a few weeks ago, where we were looking at, I guess in our case in Trinidad and Tobago, our production is higher than demand. The paradox is that people still are not getting the continuity of supply, and that's because of our non-revenue water problem, as the panel mentioned earlier. And so we have this huge desalination bill, this desalination plant, and one of the things we were looking for is a market for bulk water export. And the market is, as you said, in disaster response, because a lot of countries, that's what we do. That's what we did this year after the last eruption. Utilities were sending water by barges to St. Vincent. So yes, I think the situation has arisen where we have to think about bulk water exports and a regional sort of approach to that. So I know that Dr. Trotz also wants to respond to the private sector question, but let me bring in Dr. Douglas first, and then I'll take Dr. Trotz's response.
Sure, no problem. So you wanted my perspective on the...
Yeah, from your angle, as you were talking about the nexus between climate change and some of the other sectors like health, for example, what's the role of the private sector? Where do you see the private sector fitting in climate adaptation?
Well, I see them as a major partner to help with the whole effort, because as I mentioned, these are all interrelated. Karl Dr. Payne would have just conducted a study in Dominica, where he looked at Damasco, I forget the acronym wrong, please forgive me. Damasco, right, where he looked at the vulnerability of the water utility there in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Because of the geographical makeup of Dominica, most of their water supply is surface water. So they have surface water intakes. And during an impact like that, a climate impact like that, then you're going to have fallen debris, you're going to have all of these different issues. So he utilized the use of artificial intelligence and also to develop risk maps to identify the areas that will be most impacted and potentially pose the highest risk. And within the Caribbean, we've mentioned it, Dr. Seeley would have mentioned it, Dr. Trotz would have also mentioned in terms of the limited resources that we have. And so when you have limited resources, you want to basically get the best bang for your buck. So you want to definitely distribute the limited resources that is going to give you the maximum impact. And I think using this type of technology and planning can help and assist to actually making the right decision and most effective decisions. And I think also the use of drone technologies. For instance, if we have an impact by hurricanes, how can we, and Karl mentioned it, Dr. Payne mentioned it, in terms of what Prime Minister Motley has been doing. She's been doing a tremendous job on the international scene, trying to raise awareness regarding vulnerability of small and developing states. And so if we have a hurricane that's going to impact one of the Caribbean or several of the Caribbean countries, then in order to trigger the mechanism to get that funding, you have to be able to do your disaster, the damage assessments. And we think, with Karl and I, we believe that the use of drone technology to be able to use in association with machine learning and artificial intelligence, to be able to take videos, to be able to take photos, and to generate a damage assessment impact report quite quickly in order to trigger what mechanisms that exist to actually mobilize the funding that you will need on the ground to actually do what you need to get done. So I think those would be two technologies that I think would be most helpful. And the third one, and final one, is in terms of waste. So be able to then convert some of this biomass into green energy. So the conversion of biomass to biogas is a huge, huge, huge opportunity for the Caribbean. Also leveraging sewage as well as one source of biomass to convert into energy. We can even open up to acquiring sewage from some of the cruise ships that come in, and that can add to your infrastructure in terms of the pool of biomass that you have to then generate the level of energy that you would need. And this would also reduce the CO2 contribution and help achieve the NDCs that each of the Caribbean countries are looking to do. But I think I've said enough. I'll give some space to other persons to go.
Well, you know, time flies when you're having fun. as cliche as that sounds, it's true. So we only have 5 more minutes. So I'll ask Dr. Trotz to come in and respond, and also just briefly any closing remarks, and I'll just make a round with the panel on any 1-minute closing remarks. Dr. Trotz?
Yes, very quickly on the private sector issue. Getting the private sector involved in adaptation it's always a challenge, because invariably adaptation is about a public good. But nevertheless, we've had some good experiences with the private sector. One very quick example, the Cocoa Reef Hotel next to Hugh Hotel Airport in St. Lucia, where we actually worked with them to install an extensive water harvesting system, which provided water for their swimming pools and for the recreation activities, and a wastewater recycling facility that provided all of the irrigation for the 18-hole golf course. Since that project, which was implemented since 2010, they have expanded on the water harvesting facility and the wastewater treatment facility. The important thing is that they basically saw the business case for investing in these things. So when you talk to the private sector, in some instances, you have to basically show them that is basically not only in the interest of environment, etc., but it's a good business case for you to move in that direction. So that's one of the things that we have to learn, how we could translate these things to show the benefit to the investor. But the private sector are very much on board now, and it's time that we get wider engagement with them.
Okay. Ms. Ebanks-Petrie, a 30-second closing remark.
Thank you. Just to say that I really enjoyed hearing the perspectives of all the panelists. I would just throw out a challenge that perhaps as a region, we should consider hosting, coming together more regularly on a structured or a semi-structured basis to discuss climate change impacts, both from a mitigation and adaptation perspective. I think it's great that all of the sectors are beginning to incorporate climate change in their discussions and in their annual or biannual meetings, like this one, for example. But I think it would be really helpful to have a climate change focused discussion as a region, where all of the sectors come together and we share knowledge, we share experiences, we share lessons learned. So just a thought, I don't know whether that Dr. Trotz and the 5 Cs can consider that. Maybe they're the organization that coordinates that. I'm not sure where it would lie, but it would certainly be something I think that as we move forward, try as a region to respond to this imminent threat, that we have a place to come and share our knowledge and information. Because I also agree with Dr. Douglas's comment. It really resonated with me in the data poverty situation generally across the region. And I think there's a lot more to explore there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And we definitely will take up that call to action. Dr. Payne, 30-second closing remarks.
Yes, so thanks again to the CWWA and you, Mrs. Govia, for what I think was a very engaging panel discussion. And I totally agree with Ms. Eubanks from Cayman Islands that we need more of this type of engagement, because for me, it really was good to learn from the various perspectives of colleagues who have been working in climate change from different perspectives. But I think climate change is the greatest existential threat to humanity itself. And my understanding is that, for example, China would need to close close to 600 coal-fired power plants to really put a dent in mitigating, the impacts of climate change. But at the same time, there's a balance, just like COVID-19 has taught us, there's a balance between there's the balance between public health and the economy. There's a balance between climate change and economic development. And so I think the G7 countries really have a moral responsibility, given this existential threat, to provide the financing and provide the economic space for us to be able to build resilience and respond accordingly in the future to this great climate threat.
I'm sorry, Dr. Seeley and Dr. Douglas, we are actually out of time and my organizers are knocking at my door and saying we have to wrap up. But I thank all the panelists for your very engaging and intriguing interactions and interventions. 2%, as you said, Dr. Seeley, of the global US $80 billion is going to small island development states, and less is going to Caribbean states. So the resources are out there. We just need to find a way to get it. I want to encourage the audience to go and visit our virtual exhibition booths and also connect with the speakers afterwards via our Wova app or via their personal emails. Thank you very much to our panelists, and see you all at the next session. Thank you all.